welcome everyone. So this week's department seminar is hosted, I'm not sure how exactly this works, with the Sustainable Social Policy and Welfare States Research Hub. And in that regard, we're very happy and excited to have Tom Hale here, who's from Oxford, the Blavatnik School of Governance, who's going to be talking about his latest book, which I will highly recommend. If after this talk, you would like to say, which is Long Problems. So Tom has been someone who's been doing really important work in terms of our understanding of climate change, environmental policy, and political problems and ways we have to deal with this for many, many years now. And I wanted to have Tom here to give this talk because, of course, while it's motivated by the issue of climate change, for a social policy department, our bread and butter are long problems, right? These kind of problems which have long roots that are felt in the future, that require investments now, where we might be giving up something in the short run in order to achieve that. And so Tom is going to walk us through the various challenges and issues with this, and hopefully give us some new understanding. So without any further ado, Tom, yours.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. I did a master's degree at LSE many, many years ago. So really always fun to be back here in this great institution. I want to start with just a little thought experiment, if you will. So if you would imagine yourself for a moment as a molecule of carbon dioxide, imagine yourself in that form. We know what it looks like. Big carbon dioxide. Imagine you're now a dinosaur or a palm tree or a trilobite or some sort of ancient creature, and you die, but you are the carbon part. You sink into some kind of swamp. Over time, many more organisms layer on top of you. And over many, many millennia, eons and eons, you slowly get compressed and tighter and tighter into something that might look like, say, coal or oil or gas. And that's your, like, for most of your life, that's what you are. You're this geologic form. And then in a geologic split second ago, this happens, and you suddenly are exploded out of the ground. You're burnt by humans and thrown into the atmosphere. And this happens so quickly compared to your eons and eons of life that you barely notice it even happen. But now here you are in the atmosphere, and you will stay there for not just this year and next year, but actually many, many thousands of years to come. Most of you will be take a very, very long time to be reprocessed into the carbon cycle. And so this is, if you take the perspective of this molecule of CO2, you can see how the long problem nature, which I'm going to talk about today, is really at the heart of the climate change issue, as it is of so many issues. And the carbon that we burnt when the first steam engine set forth in the north of this country 50 years ago is mostly still up there, looking down at us, watching all of human history since then unfold. And if you think about our politics since, say, 1750 or so, think of how much that's changed, right? Whole new forms of politics exist now, new institutional forms we never even could have imagined at that time are the things that we think about. And so in my field of the science, we pay a lot of attention to what's happening in this election or how this institution has changed, or maybe if I take a very long view, like how a state has evolved through its history. It's like tiny, tiny tidbits of the scale of the carbon challenge. So that's what I'm trying to think about in the book, which Liam very kindly introduced. The book tries to ask three different questions. If we think about this kind of collision of human timescales and other timescales that we confront, how should we understand that problem? I call these long problems. I want to understand why they're hard for governments and societies to govern, to manage, to make work for us. I try to also, of course, though, think about how we can nonetheless try to govern them. And that's really the main message the book wants to say, is that even though these are hard problems, they also are amenable to different kinds of governance interventions. And we do that already in lots of ways, and we can do it much better if we were more focused and intentional about it. And the book also has a section, which I'm not going to talk about today, on how we as social scientists can better study these kinds of long duration problems. I'm very happy to talk about that, especially with this group in the Q&A, people are interested in that part. But today I wanted to focus on four kind of elements. First, of course, I'll tell you what I mean by long problems. And I want to talk about their governance challenges. That's really the kind of theoretical framework of the book. And then I want to focus mostly, if I can, on what solutions we see that are possible. This is the more empirical part of the book. And the book is not just to be managed expectations. It's not a kind of empirical study in the sense of a very detailed case study of any one or two things. It's trying to provide more of an overview of a large picture, so it's more descriptive in that sense. And then finally, I want to say a few words about what the implications of this way of thinking are for climate politics today. I just come back last week from the 30th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP30 in Brazil. And so it's a very live issue still playing out there. And of course, everywhere else, we're thinking about this question. So I'll say a word or two about that. Great, so that's our plan. First, what do I mean by long problems? That's the most important place to start. So I try to take a very simple definition in the book and define long problems as any problem whose causes and effects span at least one human generation, whatever that might be measured as. And as the carbon example I gave showed, the carbon we're burning today will be there for 1,000 years, having warming on the world, creating droughts and floods and fires and other kinds of problems. So that's clearly a very long problem if you think about it that way. One would, of course, drill into what do you mean by cause and effect and how clocks can know these kind of things. So some people might say actually the causes of carbon emissions are things like technology use or say capitalism of the system. And of course we want to think about the long multi-causal chain there. But if you take simplest way to think about it is just to say what's the most proximate set of causes, most proximate set of effects, and are they distant in time in some kind of 20 years or 25 years? That's basically what I mean by long problems. So climate change, of course, is one very clear example of this, both on the prevention, mitigation side and on the adaptation, adapting to it side. But there are many others as well. And one I don't know much about, it's not published in my work, but I'm thinking about more and more because I'm very interested in it, is demographic change and aging societies, how we manage pensions, how we manage social care in a world where people's lifespans are changing, ways of working are changing in ways that systems didn't previously provide themselves for. That's a big one. Also things like urban settings, infrastructure, the way we designed the city I live in, Oxford, is not the way people live in it today. And actually a lot of the local politics is focused around issues that are about design choices made and city planning, say 50 years ago, or sometimes it's 500 years ago, which are really affecting us today. So these kinds of problems I think are quite common. I think it's possible that we have more long problems today than we did in the past. Certainly we've had plenty of long problems throughout history. This issue is not new in some way, but I think it's exacerbated really by technological change and the pace of technological change. The ability to affect things at a systemic scale in the world far into the future is a product in some ways of our technological capacities as a society. Climate change is some example of that. Nuclear power is another example of that. AI, bioengineering, these could also be seen this kind of way. And secondly, I think this sort of collision between human systems and ecological and geoplanetary systems is another case where we're seeing more of these kinds of issues arise. Again, climate change is a great example, but things like the nitrogen cycle or biodiversity loss or desertification also have this very long time span. Right? So there's a kind of natural lengthening to the problems that we face there. So that's what I mean by long problems. And I think it's meant to be more of a working definition than a precise one, but hopefully that's clear. So why are they hard to cover? I think many people have in their heads an intuition that we have a short-termist bias in our political systems, in our maybe even our own cognition. And certainly there's lots of evidence across psychology and other disciplines to suggest that's true. What I think though we don't have the gap I try to fill in the book is not to repeat those kinds of arguments, but rather to think about this specifically through the lens of political economy, which is the field I work in. And I think there's a lot we can contribute as political scientists to this dimension, because the things that make us short-term in our own lives, like we don't go to the gym when we think we should, or we don't plan in advance for our big presentation, say, or whatever we're trying to do. Those are parts of it. It's organizations and humans, like aggregate systems, don't always just scale up from the individual level. So we need to think about this in a different kind of way. Still, I think this intuition is really right, that we don't always get ahead of long problems. So here's a picture of some world leaders meeting in Brazil as they are now, but this was in 1992. When I show this slide to most of my students, they say, I wasn't even born in 1992, so it's really a good demonstration of a long problem effect. But these people who you see here were the world leaders who met for the founding of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, and they promised international law to prevent dangerous changes in the world's climate. Since that time, they've met now 30 times since then to try to live by that promise. And I would say they have made progress on it. They've made us go from sort of disaster to less disaster, but as we know, we're not on track to meet our goals they've set for themselves. So the question is why, get together and try to deliver on this, and they seem to come short.
Like I said, 3 arguments in the book for how you can think about that from a political economy perspective. The first issue I want to put on the table is the barrier of shadow interest. So I think it's broadly true that in politics, a lot of times the way change happens comes when a group that's negatively affected by something rises up and pushes back on the thing that's negatively affecting them. So if you think about, for example, a lot of the current UK government's challenges in managing the budget that's going to work for the future politics, it's really about how to manage the pain. So we felt that who can take the pain. So really worried about the sort of reaction that, say, a higher price on rich people's houses or income tax, whatever it is going to get them. So politics is really often kind of geared toward trying to respond and finding who to not cause pain to. And if you're thinking about lung problems, by definition, the people who are being most affected by them are people in the future, the next generation of people who are going to be around. And so, of course, again, by definition, they can't come into the Houses of Parliament today or into any political system and say, don't do that to us, we're here, we don't want to be affected by it. So their interests are what I call shadows. So just kind of out there somewhere, maybe we can imagine them, we can model them, we can maybe think about them, maybe we sympathize with them, but they're not real, they don't exist, they're future interests. They're kind of like Hale's cave, reflects on the wall, lives dimly through the haze. And that I think is a really important point on who has agency and who doesn't have agency to make their interests known in politics. So even people who are like present today, but who have a big stake in the future, say young people, or pension funds, or others who have a sort of innately longer time frame, are also going to be different from these kind of future interests, right? So if you exist, you can say, I might care about that. Maybe, some point, but even after the long time horizons may not think about their own long-term interests, they might prioritize their short-term interests. But that's even these future people are even less able to do in politics. So even if they were to be able to make their voices known, they couldn't act in. This is a big challenge. The second barrier to political economy to effective governance of long problems is you might think about as a gap between the institutions we have and policy. So often in politics, when you have a problem, you create a law, policy, a regulation, maybe an organization, maybe the Framework Convention on Climate Change, as they did in 1992, to try to address that problem. And you have to design it to reflect your understanding of the problem, your understanding of the political economy and the kind of balance of power and interests available at the time, and what you think is an effective way of addressing this problem. And if you set up an institution successfully, it should endure across time. It's sort of part of the definition of an institution, really, is that it has to be somewhat sticky and durable. But as time goes on, more and more time means on average you'll have more and more chances for the problem to evolve and change in different ways. And again, this is a very common phenomenon we see. So in 1992, when that treaty that I showed you was created, mostly thought about climate change as an environmental pollution problem. There's sort of bad stuff coming out of pipes, and solutions that have less bad stuff coming out of pipes. I think we now understand quite widely climate change is much more systemic transformation in energy systems kind of problem, a social justice problem in many ways, and really most differently from then, a problem of adaptation and resilience. How do we actually make ourselves able to live in a world of climate change? None of that was really envisioned in the original document. And including very simple things. In that first set of commitments under first version of the COP, there's a very sharp divide that was established between countries that were industrialized in the 1990s and countries that weren't. And that list has never been changed in the last 30 years. Obviously, the world has changed a lot in who's industrialized and not. And just to put that in perspective, in 1992, United States and Europe, not even including Japan and Korea and other places, the United States and Europe something like 45% of global emissions in 1992. Today, less than 20%. And historically, obviously, they have a much bigger share to account for, which is really important. But obviously, you need a different way. You need a way to update this as times change. There's never was a tool. Adaptation, I think, is even a more stark example where the international regime only, I would say, in the last 5 years has really put adaptation on a footing equal to mitigation, and so the formal recognition of the nature of the problem. And even if you look today at how many countries have submitted what are called national adaptation plans to the UN, alongside their mitigation commitments, about 62 out of the 195 members. So it's really a gap in the policy space that is way behind where we should be as a world in addressing this problem. So this lag issue, I think, is really salient here. The third barrier I talked about to effective governance of long problems is early action paradox. And here, the idea is really focuses on two key concepts: uncertainty and salience. So if you have a problem that only manifests or largely manifests in the future, it's not going to be very salient. And you'll have a lot of uncertainty about what the effects will actually be, because it's so far advanced, many things happening between now and then. So governments and societies that are facing long problems are kind of like this very happy gentleman who's left off this building, smiling on the way down, doesn't yet see what's going to happen at the end, and sort of blissfully unaware, or at least it's not really front of his mind, what might be happening at the end of this week. And in politics, low salience and high uncertainty are basically like two kisses of death for any kind of political change. And what they allow, especially, is a phenomenon of obstructionism, where actors who don't want to act are going to find it very easy to find ways to block action, whereas those who do want to act are going to find it really, really hard. Just like, imagine for a second you're a legislator who wants to produce something with a big payoff in the long term. Are you going to be in office in the long term? Are you going to be able to claim a win and say, I did this and here's the benefit that's come to you? Are you going to be able to say with certainty, we have to take this medicine now because if we don't, it's going to be bad results? Are you going to have time to care about it when you have these crises going on? All these factors mean it's really hard to get political action mobilized for long-term outcomes, and you're facing short-term incentives. I should emphasize in this last point also a kind of key argument in the book is that political systems and institutions obviously moderate condition when these different forces arise. But I push back on the idea, somewhat common in public intuition, that there's a democratic bias toward the short term, whereas the democracies are worse long-term governance than autocracies. I think if you look at the sort of intuitive measure of what good long-term policy making might look like are you investing in really child education, healthcare, sound pension systems, environmental protection? It tends to be the usual suspects who invest in those things. They tend to be the most liberal, most social democratic kind of societies. And actually, autocracies on average perform a lot worse than democracies. Probably because it's highly correlated with public good provision generally, which democracies on average can do better. So I think it's much more interesting to look within regime type and say, what are the kinds of democracies, the kinds of autocracies that do better or worse, and why, what are the specific features, and go deeper under that layer, because the regime type is just too crude a variable to really think about. Excellent. We'll start on that.
Can I just ask
Please,
a
yeah.
clarifying question? So what do you mean by salient? I mean, because can you give me an example? Because I guess I'm thinking about climate change as a big salient problem. So I don't know.
It's a great example. Great question about this. So here, I think a really great set of work is coming out actually by my Oxford colleague, Professor Pepper Culpeper, for a great book called Quiet Politics. And the basic idea is that when you have a kind of regulatory battle, you get more public interest winning that battle when it's a public and salient issue. Because you're like a legislator trying to do what's right for financial regulation, say, and you're held to account. Everyone's talking about it because it's right after, say, the financial crisis, and everyone really wants banks to be better regulated. It's much more easy for the public interest to come forward in that kind of like big public debate. If instead you're in sort of normal times when financial regulation is a really boring topic, very complex, nobody pays attention to it or understands it, that's when politics happens in like much more sort of backroom sort of deal where the interest groups who care most about the issue are the ones who are trying to be regulated, are the ones who are really front and center. So salience has this really important effect of changing whose voices get listened to and whose power matters in a book this way. And so to tie back to the obstructionist issue, if something's not salient, then it's going to be the ones who care about it really most, the concentrated interests, right? Who are, in this case, often the people holding progress, who are going to be the ones whose voices get listened to. This climate change salience today, it now is much more salient than it was. But I would say it's all, but the counterfactual is really what was going on in 1992, right? Where people at that time making this promise, thinking about the fire in Los Angeles? Were they thinking about the floods in Pakistan the other 2 years ago? Were they thinking about some of the horrendous storms we've seen in Jamaica a few weeks ago? No, they weren't thinking about that. They were thinking about pollution coming out of a pipe and sort of minor tweaking and adjustments. So I think that's where the time gap really comes in. And that's another key idea here is that climate change, of course, has this rolling effect where climate change we're experiencing now is a product of the choices that were made in the past, and the climate change we will experience in the future is a product of choices we're doing now. So the people who are not presented at the table in the COP today are, it's again uncertainty, but imagine we have a situation where there are 50 million refugees around the world in 30 years, which is the World Bank's current projection for climate space migration in 2050. Think of how science that'll be in politics, where like a much smaller number of refugees is causing massive political dislocations in countries around the world. So that's the issue that's the gap I mean. And maybe I'll say more as maybe we're now in kind of interesting phase where we see enough of the impacts to care more, but aren't not yet so many impacts that we're totally unable to do anything. So this kind of timely intervention is a really interesting implication. Thanks for the question. Good. So those are the three problems we have, I think, that are common across really all political systems and that make governing long problems particularly difficult. So this is now the depressing nadir of the talk, and now we're going to go up from here, where we're talking about solutions. So what are the solutions? There's a lot, and I want to be really clear. When I talk about solutions, I don't think there's like, here's the 5 things to do to manage long problems, or like, here's the silver bullet that's going to somehow erode these really, really difficult challenges. It's not a question of obliterating them. It's a question of how do you manage politics and governance given these kinds of constraints. So it's, I would say, a modest, but hopefully realistic and practical view of what a solution is and how we should think about it. And like I said, there's thousands of them, and I'm not going to talk about all of the many examples. What I try to do in structuring the book is to think about the kinds of solutions, how they respond to the different kinds of problems and barriers are identified. So is there a category of solutions that helps us overcome the shadow interest problem by representing future interests more accurately and effectively and giving us some degree of agency in what we're making today? How do we overcome the institutional lag problem by thinking about balancing durability with adaptability in politics? And third, how do we overcome this early action paradox by finding ways to catalyze early action and increase the effect of that action onto as it goes forward? So there's lots of ways to try to group these different interventions. This is one way to group them. But the point I want to do with this is to show that there's a whole bunch of different ways of governing and different kinds of strategies and institutions that are actually giving us a way to do this. And so it's not actually an intractable, impossible task to govern across time. It's something we're already doing in lots of different ways, and we could do much more. I want to talk briefly with it, just give you one example of these, and I'll say a few more words about one or two of them just to elaborate the point. But one of the current research projects I'm working on is actually collaborating with some people to try to create a much wider sort of database. So what are these different institutions, sort of as diverse as they are around the world? There's not really good mapping I've found yet, but I'm really curious to draw more examples from your collective knowledge. So let me say one word about this first one, because this is maybe the most intuitive version. If you have a problem with people not speaking for the future, why don't you just give the future a voice in some way? And this is often done through different kinds of representatives of future generations. The most famous and probably oldest case is in Wales, just west of here, where the Welsh Senate in 2015 created a commissioner for future generations as a statutory body within the Welsh government, with an independent sort of authority to challenge government and to raise questions on how is this decision going to affect future generations. There have been now 2 commissioners in the history of this law. I think this is a really good example of where giving a little bit of agency can actually really produce some interesting effects. So any of you have studied the Welsh healthcare system? This is actually good. I'd love to know. It's something I've studied a lot, but I haven't really looked at this particular case, but I think it's really interesting. So like any healthcare system, the Welsh health system has tried to invest more in prevention and therefore to save money on treatment, because we all know prevention is the thing that governments should really be prioritizing if they want to get the best bang for their investment. But it's often really hard to kind of work through all the bureaucratic machinery and to really get that operationalized. It's sort of a thing we all know we have to do, but most bureaucracies struggle to really prioritize it. So the role of this institutional representative future generations was basically to be a kind of champion and focal point for a cohort of bureaucratic actors within across the Welsh government, from like politicians to bureaucrats, who really wanted to make allow for this budgetary decision to invest more in prevention, move forward into enact. And I think there, the case study kind of shows us how having someone who has this sort of prominence and salience and mandate to say, no, we have to think about this now, like we're having a meeting on it, you decision maker, come to this meeting, actually can make a lot of difference in driving forward results there. So you had a change in Wales where the total amount of money invested by the government into prevention was allocated. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what it is, but it was something like 10%. But it hadn't been spent. Like for years, it hadn't been spent effectively, or it had been spent kind of in ways that made it look like it was being spent on prevention, and it wasn't really being spent on prevention. So it's really about implementation and delivery as opposed to design, which I think is interesting. So please, yeah.
Who's the commissioner? Is it a young person?
It is currently someone named Derek Walker, who comes from kind of like a social justice background. He's probably at my age, so I said a medium age person. No, the first person was a woman named Sophie Hale, who was a sort of firebrand, kind of amazing communicator type person. She's the one who's did the intervention of the health system I mentioned. They have a youth kind of advisory group, but it's a kind of has not the supervisor not the young people themselves. So that's one way to do it. This is a good example, though, of someone who's a kind of gadfly within government, a sort of official, but not a decision maker, a decision an advocator, if you will. There's been other versions of this you've seen in places like actually Hungary and Israel, where there's been a little bit more authority invested into the role. And in both of those cases, they've actually been pulled back by politicians because of that. It's a really interesting sort of scope condition, I would say, for this kind of intervention, where in Israel, for example, is really the range of one legislator, and the commissioner was a parliamentary official who had sort of authority to delay legislation if there was some kind of impact in the future that would be needed to be explored. As you all know, and the students of legislative politics will know, being able to delay legislation is very powerful political tool. It means you can effectively kill somebody. It's a thing that really matters in politics. And that role was then, as soon as it bumped into some hard politics, basically destroyed. So these kinds of tools I'm talking about are not soda bullets, right? There's a political limit. And actually in Wales, we've had a lot of political consensus over time for this kind of role, and people trying to see it as a positive thing. Wales is having election next year, as many people are aware. It may change from, for the very first time it's been a devolved administration, from a Labour government to something else. And we'll see how this kind of change in politics leads to a change here. All right. So watch this space. Let me go to one example in our second column here on endurance and adaptability. So like I said, we have this issue of institutional lag. If you create a problem, you have a solution, you have a problem, you create a solution, how do you make that last in the ways it needs to last, but also update in the ways it needs to update? And here I think there's really some different tools that we could use much more if we don't use very much. So we come to the first, endurance, reflexive governance, and triggers and endurance. I'm going to talk about them together. So like goal setting is a very common governance practice across countries, international organizations, universities, all sorts of people set these kinds of goals. And sometimes they can be really powerful when they are ways to prioritize scarce resources, or to kind of orchestrate a diverse set of actors to know, actually all trying to move in the same direction on this thing. Sometimes they're superficial. So it all depends on how they get institutionalized, how they get represented in politics. But some of the ones I'd say are powerful examples. Obviously, the Chinese governance system, where I've lived and worked for a number of years, is one that really uses goal setting as a core governance practice to direct a very wide and diverse array of different governmental actors in a similar direction. And then you have ones that are maybe it's more like an assembly of ideas that maybe are being brought forward. And I think the African Union, which I've privileged working with on their 2063 agenda, has a lot of good intentions around goal setting, but hasn't actually built the machinery of governance to deliver on those goals. It's more of a kind of high-level document that is in your statements doesn't actually drill down. It's not yet into national policy making. So you kind of have these two extremes of where goal setting works as a way to mobilize coherence over time, where it is like more of a thing people put out there to make a political statement without a lot of impact. And obviously, this is one side of trying to get durability. Now, if you have goals that are, so that's great, you need to be able to update them in some way. And again, I'd say the Chinese, one virtue of the Chinese system is it kind of builds in the updating of goals into the process of the 5-year plan setting. There also be lots of mechanisms for calibration along the way. So kind of this, the data of the Chinese government system is really a kind of dynamic equilibrium between long-term goals with constant updating and revision. Whereas things like, say, development goals from the UN don't have any mechanism for updating. They have a very long list of KPIs and indicators that was negotiated in very painful, hugely painful and time-consuming ways. But it's not a built-in way to say, actually, now we have something called AI. We should think about how that impacts the future of work, and we should set a goal about that. We have to wait till the next iteration in 2030 to begin thinking about that problem. So it's simple little ways of trying to design goals and make them either more or less rigid and effective. On that point of updating, one thing I think is really underutilized across many governance systems is what people sometimes call reflexive governance. But I think what can really be understood is there a process for review, sunset, and updating on legislation? Does anyone know of any law passed by the UK government in this century which has a sunset clause? I ask because I'm looking for one. I've looked pretty hard, but I keep asking because I'm sure there must be one. I've not come across yet. But I honestly have not come across one, despite having really looked quite hard. I've spoken to a lot of the experts and tried different strategies for identifying them, because they're not called a sunset clauses. Look in very different forms, so they're not always easy to find. But it's striking to me how few times governments build in sort of review or sunset mechanism into any kind of policy or legislation. Why is this important? Well, obviously, if you have a problem that's evolving, having some kind of time and place, what Michael Mandelov calls in a great book, the temporal focal point, is actually really important. If you have a temporal focal point, okay, in 2 years we're going to revisit this, and that creates a window of opportunity for policy entrepreneurs or others to say, time to change things, or want to defend it, we know we have to defend it. If you never have a moment for that, it never comes up. You sort of bias yourself very systematically toward the status quo or to some kind of inertia. And so just having a small check is actually quite a useful thing. It's, again, I'm not talking about the grand solutions to grand problems, but it's rather a multitude of these like quite small yet sensible things we're not doing. They sometimes do more. Great. So let me come to the final categories in interest of time. How to get forward action? How do you begin to act before things are salient and when the effects are still quite uncertain? And here I want to come, if I can, to the last example here. There's some fun ones that I would like to talk about. But here's, I think, maybe the best example of this. You probably can't read these number of words, they're very small, but hopefully you can see that there are curves on a graph that go down, which is the main message. This is a graph showing you the cost of, in this case, solar technology, wind and generating technology, batteries, and then electrolyzers, which are different thing we can talk about if you want. And then here you have oil, coal, and gas. And what you'll see is that the cost of generating renewable energy has gone from very high to very, very low in a short period of a few decades. And fossil fuels are basically more or less, a lot of variation, but essentially flat over a very long period of time. And this is now a great success, of course. The world this last year has generated more energy from solar than from coal for the first time ever. So we're really in an energy transition of huge importance. People, I think, we haven't updated our mental models as much as we need to. This is really happening really quickly, not quickly enough to actually reach our climate change targets, but also much faster than many people thought would have been possible. And so the question is, how do we get to this place? And if you go back into the history of these technologies, and when they really started to be deployed, was after the oil shock caused by the war in the Middle East in the early 1970s, and the oil price followed from it. And so you had places like Denmark and California and Japan, really the only places in the world that had any kind of investment in things like solar wind. And that was a combination of sort of energy security needs, but also, so in the case of California, which was the biggest deployer of these at the time, there's some hippies who were really interested in alternative technology and so they really pay a lot of money for this kind of stuff. It's a really exciting niche thing. Over the next 2 decades, those jurisdictions like California, Denmark, Germany then paid something like $2 billion, I think, in aggregate on that first decade, like the late 1970s to the 1990s, 15 years or so. Something like $2 billion worth of additional cost to deploy a tiny amount of these sort of very feeble experimental technology. What they did over the time, and you can't really see it on this graph, but this is 1980 here at the y-axis. It came down from kind of like a niche thing to something that actually started to be deployed much more in that time. And that first step on the learning curve is a really critical one that most technologies never get beyond because they just remain in this sort of niche category. But in the 1990s, you then had a few other changes where suddenly countries began to deploy in a more rigorous way. A big factor was the Green Party coming into a coalition government in Germany in the mid-1990s, where suddenly a feed-in tariff emerged. And all these like very strange choices made by real outliers actually shaped cost and technology in a very powerful way. And so by the 2000s, we started suddenly having countries like China and jurisdictions like Texas, who had never thought about renewable energy ever before, suddenly becoming involved because the technology was kind of mature. They've had a market for it in Germany and other places. They could really begin to see themselves as pioneers in space. And of course, fast forward to now, about 70% of all these things are made in China, from the raw materials off to the manufacturing, and the cost of them is blindingly cheap. Last year, Pakistan managed to install something like 1/5 of its total industrial power capacity ever installed in a single year because of cheap solar imports from China. So this is a really radical change where a little bit of action by some outliers at the start really changed the cost and benefits that others face in the future. So you overcame the science problem and the uncertainty problem because you had action that had increasing returns. When you have action that has increasing returns, you can have a catalytic effect in this kind of way. Good. That's I think a very positive story to point to as showing that long problems, are long, but when you have processes that also have a length to them, a dynamic nature, you can meet fire with fire.
But there's also a long problem, isn't it? Take the China example. We think some of these technologies require particular know-how or minerals or stuff. Who's got them?
Yeah.
So long problems continue to generate themselves.
Yes, indeed. So these are none of those silver bullets to kind of see this. But I think the point I want to make is that the intervention by a few people at the start can have a big impact on the choices people face downstream, and that can also be an impact. Great. So I want to wrap up this because I think we're coming to the end of what Liam said I should speak to. So what does this all mean for efforts to address climate change? So I think my point in this book is really to try to make it clear that we should have long-term governance, indeed a kind of institutional agenda as part of our thinking around addressing climate change, or indeed any other long problem. And we often kind of complain that there's not enough political will to address these things, whether it be pension reform or climate change or urban infrastructure planning. But as political scientists, we need to think about like, what is the first derivative of political will? It's the institutions that generate, shape our who gets power, what interests are supported, not supported, and we can manipulate those. Those are not sort of given exogenously. Those are something that humans create. I remember that carbon down and looking down at us, you can see a lot of creation and destruction institutions over the time period. So that's something we should think much more about as a variable to manipulate. And here I'm inspired by our geologist colleagues who often say, they love this phrase, and I know you have geologist friends, but they like to say, rocks are not nouns, they're verbs, because they're always changing, they're doing stuff all the time. We see rocks as very fixed things, but of course, for a geologist, they're just one moment in time for this thing that you might call a rock. So I think we should take a similar view as social scientists of how we see institutions. And lots of people in this ecosystem do that. They think about historical institutionalism, they think about history and change over time. But I think we can make much more of that as a tool for intervention as well. Final note of folks leave you on last year, the United Nations again adopted one of these high-level declaratory normative statements at something called Summit of the Future, which took place in 2024 in September of last year. And at that summit, they adopted a declaration on future generations, which, like the 1992 summit I was showing you before, is a high-level promise. But the promise this time was to safeguard the needs and interests of future generations. So every country in the world committed to it. Even some countries at the time, like Argentina and Russia, were not so on board with the broader summit, and they kind of rejected parts of it. Even they said they were okay with this declaration, because normatively, this makes a lot of sense. We all want to leave the world better for generations of say everything. And I think this, UN declarations are need to be understood what they can do and what they don't do. What they definitely don't do is force everyone to do something. What they can do, though, is have this, I think, catalytic effect in changing norms and ideas. And here, I think we see a bit of a recognition that the institutions we have today are not particularly well suited to the needs of the problems we face, including how we manage the future. And indeed, the sort of sense of polycrisis, or whatever we want to call whatever this world we're living in is, I think is many, of course, this sort of short-term urgent crisis are laying on top of this kind of feel, but it also stems from some of the deeper systematic issues we're not addressing. So I think this idea of thinking about long problems, this kind of political summit, the kinds of interventions I'm talking about, are all part of responding to fairly intricate challenges that have a very sharp, urgent manifestation, but also are connected to these longer, deeper drivers like climate change that we influence the sun. So I'll leave you on that note of advocating for an institutional lens onto our attempts to deal with these kinds of long problems. Thanks for your attention.